January 12, 1944. Dawn hangs low over the Italian Apennines, a cold breath of fog curling through shattered olive groves and twisted stone. The war has frozen the landscape into silence, save for a sound that does not belong. It is not the groan of artillery or the shriek of steel. It is the steady chugging of engines. Light, rhythmic, almost cheerful. Down a ravine slick with mud and melted snow, American jeeps crawl upward like iron beetles defying gravity. Tires claw into crumbling shale. Engines roar against the mountain wind, and men cling to the sides, teeth clenched, helmets glinting under the pale winter light. German binoculars track their ascent from a distant ridge. To the officers watching, it seems impossible. No tracked vehicle, no armored car could have reached such height. Yet here they were, small, unarmored, unstoppable. The jeep engines echo through the valley, a heartbeat of persistence beneath the distant thunder of guns. What the Germans saw that morning was not just a vehicle. It was the sound of American ingenuity climbing into legend. And that sound, that mechanical pulse, would soon change how war itself moved. To understand that moment in the mountains of Italy, we must return to 1940, before America had even entered the war. Europe was burning. Poland had fallen, France had collapsed, and the German blitzkrieg had rewritten the very meaning of speed. Armies once moved in columns of men and horses. Now they moved with steel and gasoline. The Wehrmacht's lightning victories stunned the world, built upon mobility, on machines that could strike fast and vanish into smoke. Across the Atlantic, the U.S. Army watched uneasily. It had no such vehicle, no fast, all-terrain transport that could carry men, radio, and supplies through mud, snow, or desert. What it had were trucks, heavy, slow, and vulnerable. In July 1940, the U.S. Quartermaster Corps sent out an urgent call. America needed a lightweight, four-wheel-drive reconnaissance car that could go anywhere a soldier could walk. The deadline was absurd. Just 49 days to produce a prototype. 3 companies stepped forward: Bantam, Willys Overland, and Ford. Small workshops, not military giants. Each would shape a piece of history. Bantam, with limited resources but bold vision, built the first working model. It weighed barely a ton, with a 4x4 drivetrain and a stance that seemed more insect than automobile. Wide, short, purposeful. When Army testers watched it climb rocky hillsides in Pennsylvania, they were astonished. It could turn within its own length, ford streams, and keep pace with horses through mud. The Bantam reconnaissance car was born, the grandfather of the Jeep. But production demanded scale, and the Army soon handed blueprints to Willys and Ford. From that industrial reshuffling came a simple miracle: interchangeable parts, rugged design, and engines that never quit. The Willys MB became the standard, 60 horsepower of grit. Ford's version, the GPW, shared every bolt and curve. By 1942, Detroit's assembly lines roared with the heartbeat of mass production. Jeeps rolled out by the tens of thousands, each nearly identical, each destined for a different corner of the world. Deserts of North Africa, jungles of Burma, snowfields of Italy. They could be dropped by parachute, hoisted onto ships, or lashed to trains. To the soldiers who received them, the Jeep was more than a machine. It was a companion, a lifeline, a bridge between safety and the unknown. In letters home, soldiers called it faithful, fearless, a mule on wheels. It could carry stretchers, tow guns, or become a makeshift altar for field chaplains. It was, in every sense, the mechanical symbol of American adaptability, built fast, built simple, built to survive anything, and soon, that simplicity would be tested on terrain that no one thought conquerable: the brutal mountains of the Italian front. By late 1943, the war in Europe had shifted south. After the victory in North Africa, the Allies crossed the Mediterranean to strike at what Winston Churchill called the soft underbelly of Europe. But Italy was no soft underbelly. It was a fortress of ridges, rivers, and ravines, a natural wall that favored the defender. From Salerno to Monte Cassino, the campaign became a grinding ordeal. Tanks bogged down in mud, trucks slid helplessly on mountain trails, and mules again carried supplies like it was 1915. The Germans, masters of terrain warfare, believed the Allied advance would stall. And by all conventional logic, it should have. Yet among the endless convoys snaking up the peninsula, one machine defied that logic: the American Jeep. Light enough to float across mud, agile enough to crawl over rubble, it moved where tanks could not. To German engineers accustomed to precision-heavy vehicles, half-tracks, panzer divisions, and complex gearboxes, this stubby four-wheeled machine seemed almost primitive. But therein lay its genius. The Jeep was the embodiment of utility stripped bare. A steel shell, a flat hood, and an engine that could be fixed with a wrench and wire. Its low gearing allowed it to climb inclines that defied even tracked vehicles. It could turn on a cliff edge no wider than its frame. Soldiers often joked it could climb a tree if you gave it a chance. And in Italy's vertical war, that was no joke. It was survival. The terrain around Cassino, the Liri Valley, and the approaches to Rome became testing grounds for this improbable machine. Mountain paths once ruled impassable were suddenly alive with convoys of jeeps hauling ammunition, stretchers, and field radios. Their tires spun against loose shale, but they did not stop. Drivers learned to feel the mountain through the wheel, to sense traction, to trust momentum. German spotters reported light vehicles of unusual mobility appearing on slopes where no road existed. A Wehrmacht engineer in the Gustav Line wrote in disbelief that the enemy vehicles travel where mules and men scarcely dare. The reports were dismissed at first. How could a small American car outmaneuver their mechanized divisions? But it wasn't just about machinery. It was about philosophy. The German war engine was designed for dominance. Heavy, armored, complex. The American design was built for adaptation. Simple, cheap, universal. Each Jeep could be repaired in the field with minimal tools, its parts interchangeable across models and fronts. Where the Germans required supply chains and workshops, a U.S. soldier needed only fuel, a wrench, and willpower. As 1944 began, that difference between complexity and simplicity, between rigidity and flexibility, became more than technical. It became symbolic. The Jeep, humming up those impossible roads, was a rolling metaphor for the democratic spirit that built it. Unpretentious, resourceful, unyielding. And soon, the men who drove them would discover that these small machines could turn the tide in places where tanks dared not tread. Because on the battlefield, speed and adaptability meant survival. And the Jeep carried both like a secret weapon. The war is remembered for its grand machines, the thunder of panzers, the shriek of dive bombers, the weight of battleships. Yet, among all the icons of industrial warfare, few objects bridged man and machine as intimately as the Jeep. To understand its power, we must see it from the angles that shaped the war it served. From the moment the first Jeeps arrived in North Africa in 1942, commanders realized they had been given a tool that defied classification. It was neither a car nor a truck, neither armored nor armed, and yet it became indispensable. In reconnaissance units, Jeeps replaced horses, motorcycles, and fragile light tanks. Their lightweight meant they could ford shallow rivers, climb dunes, and vanish into scrub faster than anything else on wheels. At Kasserine Pass, patrols used them to probe enemy lines, darting between wadis and dry gullies under the roar of German artillery. Reports came back of jeeps returning riddled with shrapnel yet still running, their engines coughing, but never quitting. Commanders began to see what the Germans soon feared. These vehicles multiplied the reach of the American soldier. By the time the Allies reached Italy, the jeep had become a tactical bloodstream, the invisible network connecting front to rear. They carried maps, shells, rations, and men under fire. Even tanks relied on them for guidance. The light 444s sped ahead to find routes where the Shermans could follow. They laid telephone wire, towed anti-tank guns, and even served as makeshift ambulances, their stretchers tied across the hood and rear. Every frontline push began and ended with the growl of jeep engines, a chorus of determination in steel and dust. To the men who drove them, jeeps became more than equipment. They were companions, symbols of motion in a static, muddy war. A soldier could go days without writing home, but never without checking his jeep's oil, tuning its carburetor, or cleaning its windshield with rationed water. In photographs, you see it clearly. Grinning faces behind dusty goggles, soldiers perched on hoods, hands resting on fenders like friends leaning on each other's shoulders. They named their jeeps with the same affection given to pets or lovers. Lil Lady, Faithful, Rough Rider. Letters from Italy spoke of how a jeep's engine sound brought comfort. When a patrol returned from the ridges at night, the familiar hum echoed through the valley before headlights appeared. That sound meant survival. It meant the path was clear. To the wounded carried down mountain roads on those humble stretchers, the vibration of the jeep was the sound of life moving forward. In every sense, the jeep became the soldier's most trusted companion. Their mule, their escape, their lifeline. Where men faltered, the jeep climbed. And where engines roared in unison, morale followed. It wasn't glamorous, and it wasn't armored, but it was there, always. And that constancy became its quiet heroism. Because in a war built on destruction, the jeep's gift was movement, the will to keep going when the world stood still. At first glance, the jeep's design seemed almost crude, a box on wheels, built from stamped steel and little ornament. But its genius lay in that very simplicity. Every curve, every bolt, every joint had purpose. The Willys' Go Devil engine, a 2.2-liter four-cylinder block, delivered only 60 horsepower. Yet its torque, low gearing, and four-wheel drive transformed those modest numbers into mountain-climbing strength. Its transmission could withstand dust, snow, or sand. Its leaf spring suspension flexed over stones and trenches. Soldiers could replace a broken part using nothing more than a wrench and the spare pieces packed behind the seats. Interchangeability was total. A wheel from one jeep fit another, whether built by Ford, Willys, or Bantam. It was the first truly standardized light military vehicle, and that standardization became the foundation of Allied mobility. German engineers marveled, and sometimes mocked. Their Kubelwagens were more refined, air-cooled, and efficient on roads, but faltered in mud. The American Jeep, heavier and rougher, thrived in chaos. It could be dropped from planes, lifted by cranes, or towed behind tanks. Mechanics in the field learned to strip one to its frame in less than an hour. The Jeep was not designed for perfection. It was designed for persistence. Where the panzer represented the art of domination, the Jeep embodied the art of endurance. Captured German diaries from the Italian campaign reveal an undercurrent of awe and confusion. At first, they mistook the small vehicles for reconnaissance toys, good for soft ground but irrelevant to mountain warfare. But by the winter of 1944, reports from the Gustav Line spoke differently. The enemy moves light vehicles where no road exists. They appear on flanks we believed impassable. On the peaks above Cassino, German officers trained their binoculars and saw jeeps crawling through passes once thought safe from mechanized threat. How could they climb so high? carry so much, and move so silently. To those who had trusted in terrain as an ally, the sight was unsettling. A Wehrmacht captain recorded after an ambush. The enemy's small cars traverse ravines like insects. They are everywhere, invisible until they strike. That was the Jeep's hidden power. Ubiquity. It blurred the front line, outpaced expectation, and replaced fear with uncertainty. The Germans respected machines that roared with might. Tiger tanks, Stukas, artillery. What they saw now was the quiet weapon of democracy. A machine that conquered not by destruction, but by reach. In every army before, vehicles reflected hierarchy. Officers rode, while foot soldiers marched. The Jeep dissolved that boundary. Everyone drove it, from generals to medics, privates to chaplains. Rank mattered less than purpose. It was democracy on four wheels. A captain and his driver shared the same wind, the same mud, the same vibration of metal under strain. That shared experience mirrored the ideals the Allies claimed to fight for. Equality, adaptability, unity of purpose. Where German design glorified control and command, American design celebrated access and participation. The Jeep became an industrial metaphor for the society that birthed it. Not perfect, but free. Not polished, but powerful in its openness. In that sense, every Jeep that crested a ridge was more than a vehicle. It was an idea in motion, an argument made of steel and resolve. And soon, that idea would meet its greatest test. At Monte Cassino, where mountain, weather, and fire converged into a single crucible of endurance. Because when the path vanished into stone, only the will to climb remained, and the Jeeps kept climbing. February 1944. The Italian sky was the color of ash, and the mountains of Monte Cassino towered above the valley like ancient sentinels. Snow melted into rivers of mud that swallowed boots and wheels alike. For weeks, the Allied advance had stalled beneath the monastery that crowned the peak, a German stronghold overlooking every path north to Rome. The terrain was merciless. Roads dissolved into rock slides, rivers into torrents. Even mules struggled to climb the steep, slick trails carved through centuries of erosion. And yet, in the pre-dawn haze, movement stirred, a low mechanical hum growing louder, bouncing off the cliffs like an echo of defiance. Jeeps, hundreds of them. They moved in single file, tires biting into stone, headlights dimmed under blackout hoods. Each carried 2, sometimes 3 men, medics, radio operators, engineers, and crates of supplies strapped to every inch of metal. In the mud, the heavier trucks bogged down. The tanks groaned and stalled, but the Jeeps, light and stubborn, kept crawling upward. Reports from German outposts began to sound incredulous. Enemy vehicles proceeding along goat paths, one officer wrote. Impossible gradient, yet they continue. Another noted, light motor transport observed above our artillery positions. Cannot explain route. The Allies had found a way where none was meant to exist. Jeeps hauled ammunition to frontline mortars, ferried wounded men down icy slopes, and brought mail and hot rations to troops who hadn't eaten in days. The 4-cylinder Go Devil engine roared like a promise that the mountain would not hold them. In one sector, near Monte Trocchio, drivers lashed planks under their tires to grip the frozen mud. Pushing forward even under machine gun fire, the vehicles rattled, shook, nearly flipped, but did not fail. Soldiers later swore that the Jeep seemed alive, sensing the incline, adjusting its rhythm like a climber pacing their heartbeat. German officers, peering through binoculars, could scarcely believe it. They had seen Allied tanks trapped in valleys, trucks abandoned in craters. But these tiny machines were different. They defied terrain and expectation alike. It wasn't brute force that conquered those slopes. It was design, willpower, and motion. The Jeep became the bridge between mountain and man, the literal link holding the front together. And on those impossible climbs, where engines strained against gravity, the sound of the Jeep became something more than machinery. It became music, the rhythm of perseverance in a war built on attrition. That sound would soon echo beyond Casino, into legend, into the heart of a war that learned to move again. As February gave way to March, Monte Cassino burned beneath ceaseless bombardment. The monastery, a symbol of centuries of faith, became a ruin of fire and dust. The Allied assault ground forward through rain, smoke, and rock. And still, through it all, the Jeep engines sang along paths no wider than their tires. They brought ammunition to the forward companies of the 34th and 36th Infantry Divisions. Drivers learned to wedge one wheel against the mountain wall and the other in open air, trusting balance and luck. In the chaos, engines roared without pause, the same dependable rhythm echoing between shells. War correspondents began to write about it. "The little car that never quits," one British reporter noted, "climbs mountains as if it knows freedom is uphill." For the soldiers on those ridges, it was not poetry, it was life. The Jeep delivered not only supplies, but spirit. It meant connection in a battlefield splintered by cliffs and craters. German units defending the Gustav Line grew wary of them. They had grown used to reading the sounds of battle, the rumble of armor, the distant beat of artillery. But the soft growl of a Jeep engine now meant something different. Movement, reinforcement, an enemy that refused to stay still. One German field report described the effect with a kind of resignation. Where there is no road, the Americans make one. Where there is no way forward, these machines appear. It was not power that broke the Gustav Line. It was persistence. Each Jeep became an artery of motion, feeding the front with what it needed to stay alive. They carried chaplains to bless the fallen and engineers to rebuild bridges overnight. They hauled water, food, even typewriters for field command posts. At night, their engines echoed faintly under the stars, a reminder that even amid ruin, something still moved, still believed in the climb. When Cassino finally fell in May 1944, the monastery reduced to skeletal arches and dust. The road to Rome lay open. Behind the headlines and victory reports were thousands of tire tracks carved into stone and soil. They marked the trail of endurance. The German officers who once scoffed at the toy-like American car had witnessed a different kind of strength. Not mechanical perfection, but mechanical faith. A machine that embodied the will to move forward, regardless of cost. And as the Allied convoys rolled north, the echo of Jeep engines blended with the tolling of ruined bells. The sound that had once stunned German observers now marked the turning of the tide. Because every revolution of those small wheels was more than motion. It was a declaration. That democracy, like the mountain road, could not be stopped by steepness alone. When the guns finally fell silent in Italy, the roads that had once been rivers of mud became veins of memory. Scattered along those winding paths were the remnants of the machines that had carried an army uphill. Jeeps with dented fenders, cracked windshields, and mud still baked into their wheels. Mechanics washed them, patched them, and sent them north, toward France, toward the next campaign. By mid-1944, the Willys MB and its twin, the Ford GPW, were everywhere. In Normandy, they crawled up the hedgerows behind the first wave of infantry. In the Pacific, they skidded through coral sand under palm trees and rain. On the airfields of England, they ferried pilots and generals, ammunition and maps. Wherever the Allied flag rose, the Jeep was already there. Production surged beyond 500,000 units. In factories across the American heartland, men and women worked through the night, riveting, tightening, stamping the parts that kept the front alive. For every Sherman tank, there were dozens of Jeeps, the unsung workforce of war. They were the first to arrive, the last to leave. Field reports told of Jeeps crossing rivers lashed to pontoons, riding inside gliders, and even being converted into rail cars on captured tracks. Adaptation became instinct. Soldiers bolted machine guns to the hood, stretched canvas tops for shade, even built makeshift armor from sandbags and scrap steel. There seemed to be no limit to what the small vehicle could become. When General Eisenhower was asked after the war which tools had won it, he named four: the C-47 transport plane, the bazooka, the atomic bomb, and the Jeep. He called it America's greatest contribution to modern warfare. Its reach extended beyond the battlefield. Civilians across liberated Europe watched convoys of Jeeps bringing bread, medical supplies, and the first taste of peace. Children climbed aboard them, laughing, waving to the soldiers who tossed candy from the seats. For many, the first symbol of American presence was not a tank or a bomber. It was that small, boxy car, humming gently as it rolled through ruined villages. It represented something different from conquest. It represented help, movement, hope. Even the Germans, now prisoners, often stared at them with the same disbelief they had felt on the battlefield. The Jeep had outlasted their tanks, outclimbed their fortresses, and outmoved their supply lines. Across continents, the sound of the Jeep engine became a kind of signature of liberation, a hum that preceded change. And as it rolled into France and beyond, it carried with it the rhythm of America itself. Restless, practical, determined to rebuild what war had torn apart. When victory finally came in 1945, the world that emerged from the rubble was forever changed. And so was the image of the Jeep. What began as a tool of war had become a symbol of resilience, freedom, and renewal. Soldiers returning home wrote of how the little vehicle had saved lives, carried the wounded, or led them out of enemy fire. It was a constant in chaos, a humble creation that asked for little but gave everything. Across Europe, Jeeps were left behind, gifted, traded, or simply abandoned on battlefields that no longer echoed with gunfire. Farmers used them to plow fields where shells once fell. Doctors drove them to remote villages where hospitals had been destroyed. In Poland, in France, in the shattered towns of Italy, the sound of that same engine, once the music of war, became the heartbeat of recovery. German prisoners of war, interviewed after their release, often spoke of their fascination with the machine. It was like an animal, one recalled. It could go where we could not. We respected it, even when it carried death. Others admitted that seeing Jeeps cresting mountains or rolling through rubble made them realize something deeper, that the enemy's strength was not in its size, but in its spirit. The Jeep embodied that spirit. It was born of democracy, a product of cooperation between companies, shared blueprints, and an open exchange of ideas. There was no secrecy, no singular pride. Every bolt and gear reflected the American belief that progress comes from unity and accessibility. When the war ended, Willys quickly retooled its factories. The military workhorse was reborn as the CJ-2A, the first civilian Jeep. Farmers in Kansas and miners in Colorado bought them by the thousands. For them, it was not nostalgia. It was practicality. The same traits that had carried soldiers up mountains now carried post-war America into its new age of labor and reconstruction. But the Jeep's journey didn't end there. In Korea, it would again crawl up frozen ridges under fire. In Vietnam, its descendants would patrol jungles. Around the world, it became shorthand for reliability, from UN missions in Africa to explorers in the Andes. Everywhere it went, it carried the same identity forged in 1944, freedom through motion, progress through persistence. For the Germans who once watched in disbelief, the lesson endured. Technology, no matter how refined, is useless without adaptability. The Jeep proved that simplicity could conquer complexity, and that ingenuity, not intimidation, wins endurance. Decades later, when veterans gathered to remember the war, they often spoke not of tanks or planes, but of the Jeep. One former driver said it best: "It never quit, not once, not when it was shot, or soaked, or frozen." That sound was hope. That sound, the humble four-cylinder heartbeat, had crossed oceans and generations. It had outlived the men who built it, the empires that fell before it, and the mountains it once climbed, and as history turned its gears toward peace, the echo of that engine remained, the eternal hum of democracy in motion. The mountains of Italy are quiet now. The roads once carved by tire and blood are overgrown with grass and wildflowers. But if you stand there long enough, if the wind moves just right, you can almost hear it. A low, rhythmic hum, rising from the valley below. The sound of a Jeep engine. It is more than memory. It is a symbol. In that mechanical heartbeat lies a truth greater than any battlefield victory, that freedom endures not because it is easy, but because it keeps moving. Inch by inch, wheel by wheel, it climbs. The Germans had built machines for conquest, heavy, complex, and powerful. The Americans built one for connection, light, simple, and free. It did not seek to dominate. It sought to reach. It turned every impossible road into a path forward, and in doing so, it mirrored the nation that forged it. Imperfect, determined, ever restless. The Jeep's legacy was not written in armor or artillery, but in persistence. It carried democracy up mountains and through fire, not as a weapon of destruction, but as an engine of endurance. Even today, long after the war's echoes have faded, that sound, that humble mechanical rhythm, speaks to something timeless. It is the echo of men who believed that even in the darkest hours, progress comes from motion, because freedom, like the Jeep, never stops climbing.